Hello there, Harriet from Millennium Library back with Stuart Innes, past president and current member of the Bonsai Society. As mentioned before, bonsai are Stuart's passion. This is part 2 of a 2-part presentation with Stuart, where he will be discussing the horticultural aspects of bonsai, revolving around types, tips for getting started, styling, techniques, and care. Before we get going, I'd like to mention we have quite a number of gardening resources and information for all levels of gardeners. This includes print resources, as well as our RB Digital and Overdrive services for ebooks and e-audiobooks, and gardening e-magazines such as Gardening the Easy Way, Home Gardening, and Garden Crochet. Browse and download ebooks and e-magazines using your Winnipeg Public Library card at winnipeg.ca/library. We also have a gardening info guide that contains links, book suggestions, and more, a variety of different types of information and resources. Click on info guides on our website to find this and our other helpful guides.
Hi there, it's Stu Innes here. This is part 2 of Introduction to Bonsai, and if you're returning after watching part 1, thank you. Just 2 comments before I get started with this presentation. First is just to clarify again that although I'm a member of the Bonsai Society of Winnipeg, and I certainly support their cause, I'm not doing this on their behalf. So if you have any concerns with the presentation, please don't blame them. This is all my doing. Secondly, I wanted to give a thank you to Harriet in the Winnipeg library system for making these videos possible. I know it's been quite a challenge in these rather difficult times with isolation and everything. So, and she's busy recording this as I speak. So thank you very much, Harriet. So this is part 2, and part 1 was talking more about the artistic aspects of bonsai. We talked about history of bonsai, a little bit about what bonsai really is, and went through many different styles and types of bonsai, just to help the viewer appreciate what they're looking at, I guess, when they're looking at bonsai. And so this is more about the horticultural aspect of bonsai. And what I'll be talking about is first what makes a bonsai look like an old tree. I'll do a very quick styling example. Some species used in bonsai, in case you're wondering what types of plants we use. I'll talk a little bit about the techniques of making bonsai and care of bonsai, just so you have a sense of what's involved in growing bonsai. And then at the last, just a few tips on how you might go about getting started in the hobby if you so decided. So first, just a reminder of what the goal of a bonsai artist is in the first place, and it's to yield a miniature vision of trees with great character, and also often to convey an emotion. And I maybe didn't stress that enough in part 1, that very often there is an emotion involved in the sense that the tree might be, if it's a literati, showing you a sense of tranquility, if it's an old tree in a mountainside, showing you determination or stress, something like that. If it's a large formal upright, it might be giving you a sense of grandeur. So there are many different aspects to it. Bonsai is also, I like to call it a 4-dimensional art form. Of course, it's 3-dimensional, which is different than, say, a photograph or a picture. There's a 3rd dimension involved. And the 4th dimension here is time. A bonsai is never really finished. It's never complete. It's always growing, and so it's always evolving over time. So when it comes to making something, a small plant in a pot, look like an old tree, the question is, well, what are the characteristics of an old tree? And with bonsai, we always start at the base. The roots and the trunk are the hardest thing to change. Almost everything else about a tree you can change over time if you need to. If you think about, for instance, a big old elm tree in Assiniboine Park, and you look down, the first thing you'll notice is the big roots pushing up out of the ground. Typically, there's a large buttress at the base of the trunk, and it flares out, and then you see these roots pushing up out of the ground. So that's the first sense that it's a big old tree. The second thing is that typically there are no branches near the ground. And if you look at the picture on the lower right of this young tree, now this one's been manicured already somewhat, but very often young trees will have branches quite close to the ground. And bushes, of course, have lots of branches coming up out of the ground. An older tree typically doesn't have branches close to the ground because they either get eaten by animals or removed by people, or the small branches at the start just get shaded out by the upper part of the tree and die off. The next thing is that you generally have a gradually tapered trunk starting at the ground. It gets smaller and smaller as you go up until it eventually turns into a few branches at the top. And the same is true of most of the branches on the tree. If you follow a line from the ground out to the outer part of a tree anywhere, it just gets smaller and smaller as you go. Next is that the large branches tend to be horizontal, or at least bending down under their own weight and sometimes the weight of ice and snow. If you think about an old spruce tree, the bottom branches are even pointing downwards so that the snow will slide off. And so these are all hints that the tree is an old ancient tree. Typically, there are also foliage pads around the large branches. Again, if you look at the young tree in the bottom here, it's more or less just one big cloud of foliage, whereas with the old tree on top, you can get a sense of the foliage pads around each of the main branches. With a bonsai, we say there always has to be space for the birds to fly through. And lastly, the foliage is small in comparison to the total tree. Now that's one area where we do struggle in bonsai. We can reduce the size of leaves substantially, and we typically start with plants that have small leaves to start with, but we can't get them quite in proportion to the overall size of the tree. But when they're in large clouds of foliage, you kind of don't notice that issue so much. Now, it's not that every old tree and every bonsai has all of these characteristics, but if you have enough of them, then you get the sense that it's an older tree. This is a tree we saw in part one. It's a trident maple, and if you look at it, you'll notice the large buttress at the base of the trunk, the roots pushing up from the ground, tapered trunk and tapered branches, and the lower branches they're not quite horizontal here because it's a deciduous tree, but they are certainly coming down under their own weight. And you see the places for the birds to fly through, so to speak. And I've deliberately picked two very small bonsai here. Even though they're small, the one on the left, of course, doesn't have space between because it's a broom-style bonsai to begin with. But it does give you the sense with this mound of foliage and the look of the trunk that it is representing an old tree. The one on the right is a much more delicate design, and in fact, it's not even complete yet. The cascade branch is still being developed. And of course, even the lower branch is close to the ground, but then that's normal for a cascade style. But both of these certainly don't look like young trees or shrubs anymore. And so I just wanted to run through quickly an example of how you might take some very raw material and start turning it into a bonsai. Now, in present conditions, I had some difficulty finding good starting materials, so we have to use our imagination here. I have basically taken a branch off of a bush, but pretend that this is a small plant in a pot. And so, of course, it looks rather rough and ragged here. The first thing I would remove is remove some of the extraneous material that we know we won't need. And again, we normally don't have branches near the ground, so we remove those and we end up with something like this. Now, the next thing is that the lower branches should normally be somewhat horizontal, so I wire those and bend them down, and I also turn them a little bit so that they provide more of horizontal pads, and then foliage will grow up from these and provide a cloud of foliage. So then you continue up the tree and bend down some of the branches and so on, but clearly this tree looks rather tall and skinny, a little bit like a telephone pole. And there's a saying in Japanese culture that less is more, and that's certainly the case with bonsai. As you remove more material, quite often you yield a tree that looks older. And so I've removed some of the top of the tree, and I wasn't quite happy with that, so I'm going to cut it about here again and wire some of the other branches down. And so I end up with something like this. And if you carry on and keep wiring and bending and removing extra material, you might eventually end up with something that looks like this. Now, this branch is actually in the background, so it's going backward. It looks here like it's going up, but it's actually going to the back and providing that a little bit of that third dimension or a look of distance. And so this looks like a rather scrawny tree at this point, but that is somewhat typical of how we often start with trees. We're just establishing a skeleton, and after pruning and with care, this tree will have new foliage and new branches popping out all over the place, and will look more like a full tree. And so here we're getting close to the point where I would say, okay, that's it, and now we might have to grow this tree for a year or two to sort of build lots of new side branching and so on. But it certainly has some of those characteristics of an old tree. And if you look at it from the top, you'll notice that, again, I made sure that all the branches have their own space so that upper branches aren't shading out lower ones. And so you still have a somewhat triangular look, even looking from above. And this is another example of a tree where we used wire on the branches to shape them. And really what we do, we wrap wire on the branches and we bend them to the shape we want. And after the tree grows a little bit, those branches will retain that shape, and then we can remove the wire. So it's somewhat similar to braces on teeth. Now the other method, if you don't use wire, we call it clip and grow. And so here we're just pruning the tree and letting it grow, but you can control the direction it will grow. And these techniques are useful. I use the same techniques for pruning shrubs and fruit trees in our yards. Any pruning I do, I'm looking at exactly where I'm going to cut. So for instance, if I cut this branch here, then this bud at the end is going to take over the growth, and the branch will grow in this direction. If I cut back here instead, this bud will take over and the tree will grow in that direction. So this, if I'm looking from above, could be right and left, or if I'm looking from the side, this could be horizontal and more vertical growth. And so you can control where your plant's going to grow. Now, the only thing different on conifers is that if you remove all the buds and all the vigorous new growth off a branch, then that branch will die on you, which is not necessarily true on a deciduous tree. So if I cut this here, these little buds here will take over the growth. If I cut this branch back here, then these side shoots might take over the growth. But if I make the mistake of cutting back here, there's no buds, there's no vigorous growth back here, this whole branch will probably die. People often ask, is bonsai difficult? And my first answer is usually that it requires a little bit of time each day. It might only be 5 or 10 minutes, but it's not a purely weekend hobby as houseplants, for instance, might be. You need to be looking at your tree at least every day, and it might require water. Very often they do require water every day or two, but you're also looking for the start of any kind of issue showing up with the tree. It does require some discipline and some patience. You have to be disciplined about doing things when it needs to be done. And you need some patience because in some cases you simply have to let the tree grow for 6 months or a year before you can carry on and do the next step. It might not take 10 years to make a new tree. It look nice. It might only take a year depending on what you're starting with, but it will take some time, and you will probably have some failures along the way. You do need some training. You can get lots of training, and I'll mention some sources later. Lots of training through books and on the internet and even through the library system. What you won't find, though, is how to keep trees over winter in Manitoba, what species do well here, what materials you can get, because what is used in other parts of the world typically is not practical to get here. So those are the kind of things where you need training from someone local. Otherwise, it is just another form of horticulture. You could compare it to, for instance, growing orchids. In some ways, you can compare it to having a pet, because it does require that daily care. Now, it's not that you can't go away for a few days or a vacation. There's ways to deal with that, but trees can't be left for a week typically. I just wanted to show a few examples of what is possible in Winnipeg, just to give you a sense that you can look in books, but we typically don't get the 4-foot high bonsai here that you might grow in Southeast Asia, for instance. So this might give you a sense of what's possible in Winnipeg. These are just small little parts of different people's collections. This fellow had turned an old decrepit garage into a display area, and it was his winter storage space. There's no roof on this anymore, so he just sets the trees down and the snow falls on them. But he's certainly a very competent bonsai artist. This is just a little bit of my own collection, just to bring us back to earth. Some smaller trees here, and yes, very often you will have trees that are in all stages of development, so they won't all look nice. Here's some of the rest of my collection. I'll show you just for that purpose. Here's a little area where I cram lots of trees in, and there's a partly homemade automatic watering system here, and so this is how I deal with going away for a few days or even a few weeks in the summertime. I just have someone look at these every few days. So it's not great to look at in this situation, and I can't leave them there for a long period, but it is a way to deal with vacations. Some of the horticultural techniques we use is, for instance, with the soil, it's very granular soil, and we do prune the roots of trees regularly. Now, by that, it might be every few years, not every few months. We lift the trees out of the pot and remove some of the roots and some of the soil and replace it. And the goal there is to maximize the soil and root productivity. As you might guess, there's a small pot looking after that tree, and so we have to make use of every square inch of the soil. We also prune the branches and foliage regularly to control the growth and to reduce the size of the foliage and the tree overall. We control moisture, fertilizer, light level in order to control the growth and the size and to maximize the health. So I like to joke that we are somewhat control freaks. We control everything about the tree. Timing of each of these is very important in terms of what season and what stage of growth. And so you very much do have to understand the species you're working on and what its normal conditions are in order to do things at the right time. People all often ask, how do you keep a tree alive in a small pot? And there are two answers to that. One I just spoke to is making sure that every square inch of the soil is useful. And in comparison, I would suggest that typically for most houseplants, probably a quarter to a third of the soil is actually made use of. We make use of every square inch, or should say cubic inch of soil in the pot. And the second thing is to think about the amount of foliage versus the amount of soil. So here's a picture taken at Chelsea Flower Show a few years ago. And these are fairly large trees. There are certainly larger ones. But a thing to remember is that visually they all look quite large. But if you think about the trunk of a tree and branches of a tree, most of the material there is actually dead wood in the inner part. The live part is just a few thin layers under the bark. And so the trunk really doesn't matter in this equation. What matters for the most part is how much foliage you have versus how much soil you have. And in many cases, there's really only a layer of 1 or 2 leaves thick when you're looking at the tree. There's not that much foliage there. I always like to say bonsai artists are masters of illusion. We make something look big, we make it look full, but in fact, there's very little material there in some cases. So if you took all the leaves off this tree, you could probably squish them into 1 or 2 cups. And the same would probably apply to many of these other trees. Now, these other ones are conifers, so they have needles, and so they require even less moisture than a deciduous tree. And so really what you're comparing is 1 or 2 cups of foliage versus several cups of soil. And so it's really an equal amount in a sense of each, but that's really what the balance is all about. Now, in terms of what species of plants are typically grown for bonsai, we normally divide them into sort of 3 or 4 groups. And the first is native or hardy material. In other words, material that we would normally grow outside in Manitoba. Secondly, tropicals. Now, we do include in that things that might grow in the Mediterranean and other environments, but basically we're saying those plants have to come into the house in the winter. The hardy plants have to stay outside. Now, we do put them in a very sheltered area, but they need to go through a winter because that's how they normally live. And the third group here we call temperate. People in other areas might use a different term, but we tend to call these temperate plants. And they're plants that need a winter, but they need a winter as you might get in Japan or Vancouver or perhaps Toronto. And so we need to provide special conditions for those for at least part of the winter so that they go through that, but not through a Manitoba winter. And so some examples of hardy species that we grow is tamarack or eastern larch. So again, those are the conifers that have foliage that turns yellow and falls in the fall, so it's a deciduous conifer. They're one of the easiest plants to use as bonsai in Manitoba. In a lot of ways, they're very hardy and they're very easy to work with. Eastern cedar is native cedar as well, in the whiteshell, for instance. Mugo pine is excellent material. I always say, please do not use a dwarf Alberta spruce, because at some point, half the tree will die during the winter time. There are other varieties of spruce that are shown here. And incidentally, the green items are the ones that are easiest to grow as bonsai. Black is sort of intermediate, and red are the ones that are very difficult to grow as bonsai. And just as an example, people may say, well, Siberian elm, they grow everywhere here. They're growing even in my garden. And it's true that they survive here easily, but one of the problems is if you try pruning a branch, it's just as likely to let the entire branch die, and that's not a good thing on bonsai. So different reasons for being difficult to use as bonsai here. Ficus are one of the most popular tropical plant that we use, and there are many varieties. Unfortunately, the Benjamina ficus that you'll find in many flower shops and so on is not a good variety, because if you try bending the branches, they're just as liable to snap on you, where many of the other ficus are much better. German myrtle is a very common plant for bonsai in Winnipeg as well. Only you have to be careful you don't let it dry out completely. It's not very forgiving in that regard. In terms of temperate plants, Japanese garden juniper or Juniperus procumbens is occasionally available here and is not that hard to keep over winter, and boxwood would probably be in that category. Both of those might be sold locally as hobby plants, for instance. And then you have flowering plants and fruiting plants. Now, they tend to require a little more care for a number of reasons, but azalea are quite common, and crabapple are actually grown as bonsai in many areas. So those are just a few examples of what we might use for bonsai. I probably should have mentioned that there are quite a variety of of garden junipers that we can use as well. Where would I get a starter tree? Well, again, if you think about the list I just gave you, garden centers often have many of these plants in 1 or 2 gallon pots, or they have tropical plants. In our club, we go in what we call digs typically in spring and fall, where we find plants in bushes or in ditches and that sort of thing. You can order plants in online. It's much easier to do through a club or something like that because it's quite a process to, especially to import a tree these days. And some of the species are getting very hard to get because of limitations on import. And sometimes you can find things in your backyard. For instance, Amur maples often pop up. If your neighbor has a tree, you probably have some growing in your garden. And so there are various ways to get starter trees. We typically caution people, at least those who haven't had training, from buying sort of the ready-made bonsai in department stores. For one thing, they're often difficult species to keep. And secondly, for what you pay, you tend to get very little tree. And in more than one case, the trees are either dead or dying before you get them home. Here's just 2 examples of Amur maples that I had growing in our yard at one point, but I put them in a rather poor place for Amur maples, and so they ended up in bonsai pots. And here's a picture of a jade bonsai that we saw in Adelaide, Australia a number of years ago. Now it gets to be about 45 degrees Celsius there in the summer. And so this plant is just coming out of their summer, which would be equivalent to our trees just coming out of a winter. And so the foliage hasn't completely been replaced yet. But it just goes to show that you can use many kinds of plants as a bonsai. And so that sort of inspired me to try using a finger jade. And so this is at least starting to look like a tree. In terms of care of bonsai, watering is the most critical thing, as it is with many potted plants. Too much water, you may end up with root rot or large foliage. And we always joke that if you give it too little water, it becomes kindling. In other words, it dies. Light level is the next most critical. And of course, it depends on the species and where they grow, but many trees typically are in full sunshine, and that's where they do best. And you really do need auxiliary lighting if you're bringing plants indoors in the winter, for instance, tropicals. There are many methods of feeding. We prefer organic methods, but there are other options. For instance, using things like Miracle-Gro or Mir Acid that many gardeners are familiar with. And a big aspect of care is constantly monitoring the health of the trees. If you have a house plant and you have a problem with part of it, you simply cut it off and throw it away, or you might even pitch the entire plant in some cases. But that's not a practical option for a bonsai tree that you've spent 10 years developing. So we're constantly monitoring, looking for insects, disease, watering issues, and those sorts of things so that we can deal with them right away before they become serious problems. And you need to prune at the right time. For instance, if you leave a branch too long, it ends up getting too big, and then you basically have to cut it off and start growing a new one. In terms of winter care, outdoor species require a sheltered location outdoors. Again, they do need to go through winter time. We typically set the pot in the ground so that it freezes once in the fall and thaws out once in the spring. Daily freezing and thawing would be the worst thing for the roots of a tree. And conifer foliage, in other words, spruces, pines, cedars, junipers, they're best under the snow and out of direct sun or any wind. Tropicals do require supplemental light in the house in the winter. In some cases, the humidity and the temperature are more critical. It depends on the species. And insects are typically always a challenge when you bring things indoors. The conditions are so stagnant that there will be some type of insect that really blossoms in those conditions. With temperate varieties, again, you require that special environment, and depending on the species and where it comes from, it might be that it needs cool, it needs a drought period, or some combination of things for a few months typically. And just to give you some examples, this is again an area you saw earlier, but in the winter time I bury my outdoor trees down in the wood chips here, and you can cram them together because they don't need very much light. In fact, you'd like to keep the sun off them typically, and so you can get a lot of outdoor trees in a small area in the winter time. Here's an example of an indoor light stand for the tropicals and for other plants as well. This is one that I essentially made myself, so it wasn't that expensive. And this is an example of an area for temperate plants. It's in my garage, which is attached on two sides, so it doesn't get that cold, but it does need some extra heat. And so this is one of those shelters that are typically used for growing a different kind of plant, if you know what I mean. And here I use it for the temperate varieties. There's just a 100-watt heater in there, and between the lights and that little heat, it keeps it warm enough, but it keeps it around 0 to 5 degrees Celsius. And so in terms of long-term care, we do repot our trees. That means lifting them out of the pot, removing up to 1/3 of the soil and roots every few years as required. We restyle the branches or top when it gets oversized or out of scale for the design. And so our trees they look like old trees, but they're almost always new trees because they're constantly being rejuvenated through pruning and regrowing. And so there is no reason that a bonsai should really ever die. They should last longer than trees in the ground. You do need a strategy to control pests, especially tropicals when they're indoors. All of our trees are outside in the summer, tropicals included. They all need the sun, the wind, the humidity, and the changing conditions certainly help to control any pests and diseases. Our goal really is that the bonsai outlives its master. And so you might say, where do I get started? Certainly books and the internet are useful. I know there used to be a number of bonsai books in the library system. I honestly haven't looked for a while, but I suspect there's material there or videos. There are various bonsai teaching organizations on the internet. I haven't listed them here, but if you look through one of the links below, I'm sure you'll find them. Joining a club is always an option. One of the nice benefits of being part of a club is that, for instance, I come from a horticultural background and I struggled with the artistic aspects. I'm actually an electrical engineer by trade. There are people who are basically professionals in various artistic kind of endeavors in our club, and they had to learn the horticultural aspects. And so whatever advice you need, you can typically find someone in a club who has that sort of background and can help you. Another option is to take a course or to find an experienced friend who can sort of lead you through the things that you only will get from local people. I will say that one of the things that a bonsai artist, the phone calls we hate to get are along the line of, I'd like to buy my mother a bonsai for Mother's Day, where can I find one? Or my granddaughter bought me a tree for Christmas, how do I look after it? And I always equate that to someone phoning you up saying, I've never cooked before, but I promised I'd make my wife a birthday cake. How do I do it? It's really not a fair question. We'd like to answer those questions often by saying, go to a department store and find a plastic tree. But if you want to do someone a favor, I would suggest pay for them to take the course first, and they'll find out an awful lot of information, including whether it's something that they are interested in the first place, truly. So there are a number of options. The Bonsai Society of Winnipeg does provide a course each year. Unfortunately, we had to cancel it this spring, as with many other things. and even attending meetings, you do tend to learn a lot. I have listed one other contact site here, Bonsai Clubs International. They're kind of the lead group, you might say, in North America, and their site has lots of information on different kinds of bonsai and different organizations and that sort of thing. So between those two links, you can get an awful lot of information. And I've provided my own contact information there, and I certainly don't mind answering questions. So I hope you've enjoyed both of these presentations. And hopefully, if you see bonsai or a bonsai show now, you'll be able to appreciate what all is involved. Thank you.
Thank you again, Stuart. For those of you who have tuned into our bonsai presentations, thank you for watching. Make sure to check out the various titles we have available on bonsai, such as the Ultimate Bonsai Handbook, the Complete Guide for Beginners, Happy Bonsai, Choose It, Shape It, Love It, and Bonsai Beginner's Bible. And please follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.